the planned surrender of Australia. So perhaps we might start by plunging right in by raising a question called the new international economic order. Now, if you listen to the critics of the League, of course, that's just simply a product of Eric Butler or his colleagues' overheated imagination. The idea there's any sort of a program like that is too silly for words. Well, let us look just at hard facts. Let us first start with the Australian Labor Party's own platform. And in that Australian Labor Party platform, you can read in black and white that that particular political party is pledged to incorporate Australia into the new international economic order, which means, in essence, that our total economy must be incorporated into a global economy. And if you are following this and can understand the double talk, you'd be listening to Senator Button. Senator Button keeps telling you we've got to restructure the Australian economy, both primary industry and secondary industry. That's one of the new buzzwords, restructuring. What does that mean? It means progressively phasing out some sections of our economy, amalgamating other parts of our economy to fit it into an international order. That's what it's all about. So it's no secret as far as the Labor Party is concerned. There it is in their platform. Well, of course, at that stage, the dedicated party devotees immediately say, well, that's horrible, that's terrible. They are engaged in the program of surrendering part of our sovereignty. We must get rid of them. We must bring in the opposition. Now, there's only one problem about that, my friends. There is no opposition. Because, you see, I don't care whether you speak about Mr. John Howard or you speak about Mr. Peacock, they're all dedicated to the same program and have said so. And if you've forgotten, I must remind you that for 7 years, up and down this country, a man who many people believe was a Conservative Prime Minister, Mr. Malcolm Fraser, preached the virtues of the new international economic order. He didn't exactly call it that. He spoke about something called the North-South Dialogue. But translated into English, that meant that Australian economy must be restructured to fit it into the new international economic order. Well, you can go back a little further, and of course, formally you might say this part of the program really emerged in the open back in 1974. In 1974, Dr. Henry Kissinger, that high-powered spokesman for those groups we'll look at it a little later who really exercise power in this world, the great international banking groups, he gave a tremendous address, a keynote address of that holy of holies called the United Nations. And in essence what Dr. Kissinger said was this: the problems of the world now are so great, the problems of all the nations of the world are so great that no individual nation can solve these problems on its own anymore. What we've got to do is to internationalise the program. In other words, if you can't solve a problem on a small scale, the thinking is if you make it big enough, in essence you'll find a solution, which is quite a strange way of looking at a problem, which to me is rather like saying to the alcoholic, there's only one solution: increase the consumption of alcohol and you'll eventually get somewhere. Now, that address was given and the United Nations formally agreed. All members voted for it. The Australian representative put his hand up. What about the Soviet Union? They voted for it. In fact, the Soviet Union said, in essence, this idea had been thought of a long time earlier by a chap called Lenin. He actually, they said, was the father of the idea. All that the rest of the world was doing was catching up now. What about that country very much in the news at the moment? Communist China. They're also for the new international economic order. So you see, there is a program. You can look, for example, at great international bodies like the Trilateral Commission. Now, the Trilateral Commission is three major groups, headed currently by David Rockefeller, the great Chase Manhattan banking group, and they are pledged to advance the cause of the new international economic order, which in essence is that we internationalise the economies of the world. And Lenin was correct when he said you can't create a world state unless you first of all got a world economy. That's the foundation. You must destroy the economic independence of all the member states of the United Nations before you can establish the world state. And they're quite right when they say that. So the new international economic order can be studied and read. The great tragedy about it, of course, you'll often find politicians who will assure you, like Senator Boswell and others, that it's all a figment of Eric Butler or someone else's imagination. There's no such program, which in essence seems to mean that we're all going the one direction just by bad luck or chance. There's no program behind it. The truth is there is a program. And we shouldn't be surprised about that program, because what we're discussing, ladies and gentlemen, is an idea as old as man. And so tonight I want to take you back a little in history. I want to cover quickly, in a broad sweep, some of the aspects we've got to get our minds around. And so we've got to start with what I call a few absolutes. One of the absolutes concerns the subject of power. Now, ever since there have been human beings on this world, some of them wanted power. They still want power. You see it every day. The will to power. That's as old as man, starting, as I said, with Alexander the Great, right up to the Soviet Union, other groups wanting power. Now, the absolute power is, of course, the one that we're warned about by the great Lord Acton when he said that all power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is an absolute. Now, it's not very fashionable today to talk about absolutes. So I must make it quite clear here, ladies and gentlemen, I believe in absolutes. I believe that 2 and 2 still equals 4. I believe there are absolute natural laws, and I'm going to discuss them. You can't change them, you can't alter them, but if you're sensible and got enough humility, you can discover them, and then much better still, you can obey them. I suppose one absolute we might give as an example is the law of gravity. That's an absolute. You mightn't like it. You might say it's inconvenient. You might even be one of these highly educated people who on the blackboard can prove it doesn't exist. But I don't care how educated you are, and I don't care what you believe, and I don't care whether you're rich, I don't care whether you're poor, I don't care whether you're good or whether you're bad. But if you jump over the cliff, you'll always get the same result. That is an absolute. The truth is that no individual can be trusted with excessive power. In other words, the only safe place for all power is in the hands of the many. Decentralized power, with every individual personally responsible for the power he uses. Not as we are getting today in our highly centralized society, where power is used by individuals in different fields, political, economic and financial, and they are not personally responsible for that power. I suppose an example of what I'm talking about is David Rockefeller. Now, David Rockefeller, back in the 70s, established the Chase Manhattan Bank at a time when Mao Zedong was leading what today is called Communist China. And he went back to the United States and he wrote a most remarkable article. It wasn't a comment off the cuff. And he said that what's taking place in Communist China is the most constructive revolution of the last 2,000 years. He said this is a tremendous step forward in the history of man. And here was Rockefeller using power no man should have through finance to modernize China. It'd be very instructive to hear from Mr. Rockefeller right at this moment. Does he regard what's taken place as a manifestation of one of the greatest achievements of the last 2,000 years? We shouldn't be surprised what's happening in China. It is the manifestation of power. Power, and the men who've got power are so corrupted, they're not going to relinquish that power. They're even going to use naked force. And with modern technology, they can do that. And the great tragedy is that the damage has to be done. We have to see this before some of our so-called intellectuals will at least humble themselves to admit this is the problem. And so I'm always a man that's looking for some bright lights in the situation. Perhaps you missed this last Saturday. One of the most remarkable articles I've ever read. An article by a man who said Eric Butt was the most dangerous man in Australia a couple of years ago. His name is Philip Adams. Read his article. Philip Adams now says, we've got to admit, we're all suffering from delusions. And he spelled it out publicly. The same man, I might say, of course, for one time, was a great supporter of the Soviet Union until, of course, the Hungarian uprising. And that shook him a little. He moved then to the Fabians. But now he's shifted a bit more because, you see, there's the manifestation, the end of the result of power. And so this question's got to be examined. And it applies to everyone, whoever he may be. Power. The whole of history can be written around it. And linked with that, of course, is another absolute, and that's the one that we've got to direct a lot of attention to at the moment, about government. We're having a lot of discussion about government, being debated. What are we talking about? What is government? What's it all about? The absolute about government was enunciated by one of Acton's great contemporaries, Lord Bryce, in the great classic, Modern Democracies. Now, Bryce said this: it is the natural tendency of all governments to increase their own power. That's as absolute as the law of gravity. It's no good saying they ought not to do it. The reality is they do it. And ever since men have been trying to govern themselves, therefore they've been grappling with this problem. As social beings, we live together. We must live together. We must have some form of government. But how do we take action, or how do we have some sort of a program that ensures that government of its nature doesn't take more and more power until government becomes a monster? How do you deal with that? The people must be consulted. Well, away we went, and it wasn't long before the worst fears of some were really manifesting themselves, and all governments up at Canberra got that itch. That's the nature of government, particularly central government. A little more power. Not too much for a start, but just a little bit. Generally because they want to do good. I want to stress this, you know, because many people get fooled by this whole question of power, and they say, yes, but this group here, they're well-meaning. They are pleasant people. You know, they are very intelligent people. Some of them are very well educated. They're rather like the do-gooder. No, the do-gooder is a very pleasant person, I generally find. You know, the do-gooder is just that person that wants to do good to you, whether you want it done to you or not. And then you see, he just wants enough power so he can do good to you. Might be just so he can fluoridate the public water supply or do some of these other things. But you see, when he takes the first step, he starts to corrupt himself. And the end result is predictable. You can predict what's going to happen. Power. And so away we went. But fortunately, any major changes in the power structure in this country had to be brought back to the people. And so every time it came back to the people in the main, the people at referendum said no. And that was the position right up until the Second World War. Now, as we entered the Second World War, we had a remarkable man here, an Attorney General by the name of Dr. Evatt. And I just want to say this without going into any detail, that Dr. Evatt was a very able man, a very clever man. Nothing wrong with his brain power. But he had a certain idea about power. And he genuinely believed if he and his colleagues up at Canberra had it, after the Second World War was finished and all the servicemen come back, we'd have some sort of a utopia we could create here. But his big problem was he tried to stampede the people. Now, why did Bert Evatt have that idea? Well, you see, Bert Evatt, Dr. Evatt, belonged to that movement called the Fabian Socialist Movement. Now, if you will take notice of what the Ron Boswells and all these other people are saying, you see, the Fabian business is not a serious business. It's just perhaps a few academics having a little chat now and then, and this wretched League of Rights is trying to elevate it to some sort of a great menace. What is the Fabian Society? Well, we don't need to go beyond one outstanding authority on the subject, namely your own Prime Minister. Prime Minister Bob Hawke. He's a member of it, but he's done more than be a member of it. He's told you what it's all about. So let's just look at that little incident. It's important in this program of surrendering control of Australia. You will recall back in 1983 how Bob Hawke came to office. Quite a dramatic development. Bill Hayden, he felt even the drover's dog could win, but he was pushed aside, and this new pop star was brought on the stage, and he was elected. Well, a remarkable number of things happened. First of all, the great drought broke, and people said, there you are, this chap's different. Then we won the America Cup, and he was at every cricket match, every tennis match, where everybody was winning. There was Bob Hawke on the front pages everywhere. Played cricket with the kids. We'll call one example where he got a black eye, and that was on the front pages. This was Bob Hawke. You almost thought he might start to walk on water any minute. Now, in 1984, in the midst of all this tremendous publicity, your Prime Minister gave a quite historic address in Melbourne at a dinner. It's not quite clear how many were there, but at least figures vary from 1,000 up to 2,000. But what we do know is that some of the most prominent of your fellow Australians were all at that dinner, ranging from High Court judges, Supreme Court judges, academics, newspaper men, were all there. Now, what was the dinner about? It was to commemorate the founding of the Fabian Socialist Society way back in 1884, when a group of Marxists decided the English-speaking world would never accept the drive for power along the Bolshevik road. You have to have it under program. And the Sydney Webbs and all the rest devised that program. They've told you all about it. You can read that old cynic George Bernard Shaw of how we joined all the political parties, including the Conservative Party. And it wasn't long, they were all putting forward ideas that would never have come into our heads if we hadn't have put them. It's all there. But you see, Senator Boswell and these other politicians, it's all a myth of our, figment of our imagination. Well, now, this address by Mr. Hawke outlined the roots of his thinking, where his ideas come from, the role of the Fabian, but even more important, where he was going to take this country. He spelled it all out. And when you tell people about that address, I well understand those who say, well, that's just astonishing, because I don't recall even seeing that on the back pages, still less on the front pages. And of course you didn't, because the media, which had been putting this pop star up there on every other issue, for some reason this wasn't rated newsworthy. Made about 3 lines in the Sydney Morning Herald and a couple in the Advertiser, and that was that. In other words, the media of this country didn't think that was newsworthy, and that's an interesting situation itself. But what happened is rather interesting. And I got to confess this, must confess this, that one of those supporters of that wretched League of Rights, a lady, wrote a very coy letter to the Prime Minister's secretary. And she said she'd always been interested, which was truthful, in Mr. Bob Hawke and his activities, and she'd just seen a brief reference to this address, and she was quite sure it would contain some of the usual in-depth and comments that we'd expect from Mr. Hawke. Would it be too much if she could get a copy? And that private secretary was so delighted that someone would be interested enough, he shot it to her. And then a dreadful thing happened. That League of Rights got hold of it and started to distribute it all over Australia. You can read it there on the table tonight if you haven't got a copy. There's no secret about it anymore. I don't know if that secretary got the sack about it. But you see, according to the critics of the League, this doesn't exist. I am not aware of one member of the opposition that got up in Parliament and used that address to belt Bob Hawke around the ears. No, completely quiet about it. Why? Well, you might be aligned with that dreadful League of Rights, because they've been talking about this for a long time. That's the Fabian movement. Bert Ebbett belonged to it. He's a close friend of one of the doyens of that movement, Dr. Harold Lasky of the notorious London School of Economics. And Bert Ebbett felt the need for power. Well, he couldn't get the people stampeded enough to hand the power over, so we had to have the 1944 referendum in this country. And the Australian people again said no. Overwhelming no. There was only one group who said yes. That was my group. Not me, but my group, the servicemen. Wherever they were serving, it was interesting this. You might just remember this. Whether they were serving in Europe, in the Middle East or in New Guinea, in the main they voted yes. Well, why would they vote yes when all the population at home were voting no? Well, they were dependent for most of their information about political matters on an organisation called Army Education. And some very interesting people used to run that. There was a young lieutenant by the name of Dr. Jim Cairns. Now, you must have heard of him. To put it quite bluntly, the Fabians, the Marxists ran it. So the troops were saturated with that sort of thinking, which indicates something you might think about. If you got complete control of the media and only put one view, you might get the result that you want. Bert Evatt was upset, and at that stage then a new development started to take place. No argument about that. It was quite clear if you were going to have a say for the Australian people, they were always going to vote no. Now, at that moment, this idea that I want you to get your minds around started to develop, because our future depends upon understanding it. And in essence, they said, well, we've got to find some way we can change the power structure without consulting the people. They looked at the external affairs, that's section 51, just those two words. Now, the framers of the Constitution never ever visualised this would come about. They saw the external powers naturally belonging to the federal government for simply arranging association with other members of the British world and other nations, that's all. But now, said Bert Evatt and those around him, we can use that. We can start to develop international agreements. That's constitutional. This holy of holies called the United Nations is emerging. We can sign conventions with that. And then we can argue, because we've signed a convention, we've signed an international agreement, therefore we are required to legislate for the whole of Australia to give effect to that agreement, even if it means overriding the states and the Constitution. Now, I well recall shortly after the Second World War giving lectures about this, because I'd been studying these matters ever since I was a boy at school and trying to warn my fellows about it. And I well recall, of course, the reaction one got at that time. And I well recall a couple of people saying, in essence, poor old Eric, bit troppo, up in the islands too long, seeing them under the bed. I mean, he's trying to tell us now we're going to reach the stage we won't have a say, and the Constitution there says in black and white we must be consulted. Have another drink, you know. Cheap Jake, mate. Well, you see, Fabian is a movement of gradualness. It's like my little story about the frog. If you haven't heard it, I'll tell you, and the others forgive me. Take a frog, a nice, live, healthy frog. You toss that frog into boiling water, and as soon as he gets that boiling water, his reflex results in an attempt to jump to safety. But if you put the same frog in cold water and then just slowly increase the temperature, all the frog does is keep adjusting. As long as you don't overdo it, slowly but surely keep swimming around, and you know eventually you can boil him alive. We're the frog. And the temperature's been progressively increased. Those who are old enough will agree with me that we're accepting things in this country which 50 years ago would have produced a revolution. We're like the frog, we've been convinced. That's Fabianism, slowly but surely. Until eventually, in the year 1982, the first warning signs emerged. Quite open, you couldn't argue. It's a piece of legislation brought down by the Commonwealth about Aboriginal affairs. Won't go into it. Your state government said, just a minute, you can't do that. That's contrary to the Constitution. They held up the Constitution. We'll go to the High Court. And they went to the High Court. It's called the Kuwata case. And what did the High Court say? By a majority, admittedly a majority, but it was a majority of 4-3, they said because an international convention had been signed, the Commonwealth could do what it liked. And the dominant member of the majority was a very interesting man by the name of Mr. Lionel Murphy. Mr. Lionel Murphy was one of the guests at that famous dinner in Sydney, in Melbourne, a long-term favourite. And I might just say this, if ever there was a man that typifies that famous Shakespearean observation that the evil that men do lives after them, the good's often turned to their bones, it was Lionel Murphy. This is the impact of ideas, my friends. And then the next year, of course, Mr. Hawke had his election. And during that election he said, now, if we're elected, those carriages down there in Tasmania that want to build a dam, that's going to be stopped. And as soon as he was elected, they took steps to make it clear to the Tasmanians no dams are going to be built down there without their permission. In fact, Senator Evans, just to make the message clear, did something that never been done in this country before. He sent an RAF plane down there, fired to fly over the top of them. They didn't go down too well for the Tasmanians, although he did say later he thought it was a good idea at the time. But the Tasmanians said, you can't do this to us. You see, they took out the constitutions and they looked at section 100 and said, in black and white, we've got control of rivers and waterways. You can't do this to us. The High Court ruled again, 4-3. Sorry. There's a convention, this time a United Nations convention. A part of Tasmania has been put under something called the World Heritage Commission. And because it's been put under the World Heritage Commission, that part of Australia has been surrendered, and the Commonwealth can say what's going to be done and what can't be done. And if you'll get your mind around that, ladies and gentlemen, do you realise now, with this development, all that the Commonwealth's got to do is to keep allocating different parts of Australia for listing under the World Heritage Commission, which is administered by the United Nations Educational and Cultural Organisation, one of the most Marxist-dominated parts of the United Nations, so much so that the Americans and the British refused to finance it for a period. Do you realise they can now give the whole of the country away and they don't need to consult you? And that's the problem up in North Queensland. The tragedy is your state government has not fought this question on the fundamental principle. What they should have done was, in essence, say, right, this is unconstitutional, what you're doing, you just keep out of here, perhaps send Senator Richardson back with a little better treatment than he got the last time, and make it clear that is that, and have a showdown. Or even do what Sir Joe once used to talk about, perhaps we'll talk about seceding out of this association, if that's the way we're going to be treated. But no, they're just negotiating. And the organisations which should be defending us, the National Farmers Federation, what are they saying? You ought to have a look at this, because we're going to have Mr. Ian McLaughlin, the Federal Parliament, soon. Some people think he's one of those white shining knights that's going to come on the stage and save us. What are they saying? They're saying the only disagreement we've got about what's going up there is the compensation terms are not good enough, which in essence is saying we want better surrender terms. But they're not arguing about whether you should surrender or not. Surrender. They've got at least 100 areas now listed around Australia as potential areas for the World Heritage, the wildflower areas in West Australia. And people argue about conservation. It's got nothing to do with conservation. It's got nothing to do with the rain tree forest, nothing to do with the wildflowers in West Australia. It's got to do with how do you get power. And they've now got a means by which they can do it without consulting you. When Mr. Gough Whitlam, a member of the Fabian Society, addressed one of the early Aboriginal national conferences, he said, don't worry about the local politicians here. Take this question to some of the world bodies, because you see, we've signed conventions concerning Aboriginal affairs. That's the source of power. He told them that. Here was a man, our Prime Minister, in essence, telling you bluntly about surrendering the country. And that's what it's all about. And we've got to understand that.